For most of the Vietnam War, surrender was rare. The Viet Cong fought with a ferocity shaped by ideology, loyalty, and necessity. They lived in tunnels, slept in the dirt, ate what the jungle allowed, and died without complaint. To them, surrender meant failure not only for themselves, but for their families and villages. Many carried grenades not for throwing, but for turning on themselves if capture seemed inevitable. Yet, beneath this hardened exterior, an unexpected pattern began to emerge across the battlefields of Phuoc Tuy Province, the Central Highlands, and the Mekong fringes. When surrender did happen, when a Viet Cong soldier realized there was no escape, when the firefight closed in and the air filled with dust and fear, they often made one very specific choice. If given the option, they stepped toward the Australians. Not the Americans, not the ARVN, not the South Korean units nearby. They looked for the men with green and brown face paint, the ones who spoke little, moved slowly, and fought with unnerving precision. They surrendered to the soldiers with slouch hats, or to the silent phantoms of the bush, the Australian SAS. To many Westerners, this was baffling. Why would Viet Cong fighters, trained to despise foreign occupation, choose to lay down their weapons at the feet of Australians rather than their own countrymen or the most powerful military on earth? But in the whispered testimonies of captured VC, in the writings found on their bodies, in the interrogations and interviews conducted long after the guns stopped firing, a consistent truth began to surface. The Australians will not kill you if you surrender. The others, you cannot be sure. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't myth. It was experience passed from fighter to fighter, unit to unit, sometimes spoken, sometimes only implied through gestures and glances. American forces were feared for their aggression, their overwhelming firepower, and the chaos that accompanied their engagements. ARVN troops, driven by revenge and heavy losses, were known fairly or unfairly for harsh treatment of prisoners, especially those caught after ambushes. But Australians carried a reputation entirely different: quiet, disciplined, professional, and, above all, controlled. They killed when needed, and efficiently. But when the enemy stopped fighting, the Australians stopped fighting too. No executions, no beatings, no humiliation, just procedure. It was a small difference, but in war, small differences meant everything. One Vietnamese defector later summarized it in a single sentence: "If I must die, I prefer to die fighting the Americans. If I must live as a prisoner, I choose the Australians." And so begins the strange, largely untold story of why some of the Viet Cong sworn enemies of Western forces quietly believed that the Australians were the only soldiers worth surrendering to. To truly understand why NVA soldiers often chose to surrender to Australian forces, we must look closely at the three different faces of the war they encountered on the battlefield: the Australians, the Americans, and the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. Though they fought on the same side, each of these forces brought a different energy, strategy, and reputation into the jungle, and the NVA noticed. The Americans were everywhere. Big operations, big guns, big numbers. They moved fast, often in loud convoys or large infantry formations. Helicopters buzzed overhead, spraying bullets into the trees. Jets screamed past, dropping napalm and bombs that turned whole patches of jungle into blackened moonscapes. Their presence was hard to miss, and for NVA fighters, impossible to avoid. To many in the NVA, Americans were seen not just as the most powerful enemy, but also the most unpredictable. Stories spread of wounded or surrendering VC being shot, of prisoners being disappeared after interrogation, and of villages treated as enemy territory by default. Not all of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Perception did. The ARVN, meanwhile, presented a more complicated picture. Fighting for their own country, many ARVN soldiers were courageous and capable, but others were poorly trained, under-equipped, or led by officers more loyal to politics than to tactics. Among the NVA, there was little respect for the South Vietnamese regulars. Captured VC often described ARVN units as more likely to mistreat prisoners, especially fellow Vietnamese, than foreign troops ever would. In their eyes, surrendering to ARVN meant humiliation at best and death at worst. Many NVA fighters believed that being taken alive by ARVN meant torture, revenge, or execution without mercy. They were, after all, considered traitors from the same soil. And then there were the Australians. They came in small numbers. They moved like shadows. They didn't fight for headlines or body count statistics. Most NVA didn't even know when Australians were nearby until it was too late. But slowly, stories started to circulate. Stories of Australians who fought hard and without hesitation, but who rarely abused the defeated. The NVA learned that the Australians were disciplined, consistent, and uninterested in grandstanding. They didn't treat every enemy as a propaganda trophy. They didn't interrogate with fists or fire. They didn't promise mercy, but neither did they promise cruelty. They simply did their job, and when the job was done, they didn't take it out on the wounded or the surrendered. In the fog of war, where every rumour could mean life or death, these reputations mattered. An NVA scout might tell a comrade, "If you must be captured, look for the Australians. They're ghosts, yes, but not monsters." That quiet difference between a ghost and a monster was everything. So when an NVA platoon found itself cut off, low on ammunition, with no way to escape, their choice wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. And more often than many expected, they didn't run toward the loudest force, but toward the most silent one. In the dense green corridors of Phuoc Tuy province, the Australians earned a paradoxical reputation among NVA fighters. They were the most dangerous enemy in combat, yet the safest to surrender to. It was a contradiction that puzzled many young soldiers in the north. How could the deadliest force also be the most trusted? The answer lay in the Australians' unique way of waging war. Unlike the Americans, who often relied on overwhelming firepower and large unit tactics, the Australians preferred small, slow-moving patrols that blended into the jungle. They rarely spoke above a whisper. They moved in short bursts, stopping often to listen. They struck only when they had complete advantage. And when they attacked, they did so with frightening precision. Survivors of these encounters described Australian assaults as shocking in their suddenness and efficiency. There was no shouting, no bravado, no wasted ammunition, just sharp bursts of gunfire, perfectly placed claymore mines, and grenades thrown with the cold accuracy of hunters. Once engaged, Australian patrols didn't let targets slip away. They pressed the fight with discipline, clearing arcs and withdrawing methodically when needed. To NVA units, these weren't undisciplined soldiers chasing body counts. These were professionals. A captured political officer once said, "The Australians fight like tigers, quiet until they strike. And when they strike, it is to kill, not to terrorize." But what set the Australians apart wasn't only how they killed it, was how they stopped killing. In many documented cases, when an NVA soldier dropped his weapon and raised his hands, the Australians ceased fire immediately. They didn't mock him. They didn't beat him. They didn't drag him behind lines to be paraded or humiliated. Instead, they disarmed him, gave him water, sometimes even bandaged his wounds, and escorted him to a safe rear position for questioning. To the NVA, this behavior was shocking. It violated everything they had been taught about foreign troops. They expected cruelty, punishment, or execution. Instead, they found restraint. There was a story shared among NVA veterans about a young sapper who surrendered after being wounded during an ambush. He expected to die. Instead, an Australian medic barely older than he was treated his shrapnel wounds and lit a cigarette for him. The sapper later told interrogators, "I hated them, but at that moment, I respected them." These stories, quiet moments of unexpected humanity, spread just as effectively as tales of Australian ambushes. A pattern formed. Australians fought brutally when threatened, but treated captives as human beings once the danger passed. This combination, mortal danger in battle, but dignity in surrender, created a strange form of respect. NVA soldiers may have feared the Australians more than any other Western force, but it wasn't the fear of cruelty. It was the fear of facing a superior hunter. And when surrender became the only path to survival, many NVA soldiers preferred to face that hunter because they knew the hunter kept his word. He was 19 years old when he laid down his rifle. His name isn't remembered in official reports, but his story lived on through whispers in prisoner camps and interrogation rooms. A sapper from the South Vietnamese army, he had crawled for hours through mud and roots, blood soaking through the bandage wrapped tightly around his left thigh. Shrapnel had torn the muscle during a failed raid near the Australian perimeter. His comrades were either dead or scattered. He was alone, wounded, and surrounded. He had two options: bleed out slowly in the jungle or take a risk even more terrifying. He chose to surrender. Through sheer will, he pulled himself toward the edge of the rubber plantation. That's where he saw them. Not the thunder of American boots, not the barking of ARVN squads, but 6 Australians, spread in a silent patrol formation, scanning the tree line like panthers. Their weapons didn't shake. Their eyes didn't blink. They were calm, deadly, and focused. He didn't speak. He raised both hands and kept crawling. One of the Australians moved forward, rifle ready but pointed at the ground. No shouting, no sudden movements. Just a quick assessment, a soft hand on the radio, a short command in clipped English. Another man came forward, a medic, it seemed. They wrapped his wound. They gave him water. One even broke off a small chocolate ration and handed it to him. He was tied, yes, of course. He was still the enemy. But they didn't beat him. They didn't curse him. They didn't strip him or spit on him. And when they carried him back to base on a stretcher, they didn't parade him like a prize. They simply delivered him to the rear and returned to the jungle, just as quietly as they had come. This wasn't a myth. It wasn't some isolated incident. Across multiple engagements, captured NVA soldiers described similar experiences with Australian troops. Some even said they had been told by their commanders, "If surrender is your only option, find the Australians." The reasons were practical as much as they were emotional. Many POWs knew that surrendering to ARVN troops risked execution or worse, public humiliation. Surrendering to Americans, while less dangerous, could still mean rough treatment or being used for intelligence under duress. But the Australians? The Australians had a reputation for restraint, not weakness, for professionalism, not politics. Even the way they moved through the jungle, patient, cautious, deliberate, made them feel more like soldiers of principle rather than soldiers of ideology. They didn't come to humiliate or conquer. They came to complete a mission, and if that mission didn't include cruelty, they left it behind. Over time, a strange reverence formed. NVA soldiers didn't want to fight the Australians, but if they had to surrender, they hoped it would be to them, not out of friendship, not out of cowardice, but because somewhere in the shadows of war, the Australians had earned their enemies' respect. And that, in Vietnam, was a currency more rare than victory. It wasn't kindness that made NVA soldiers respect the Australians. It was control. The Australians didn't try to be liked. They weren't soft. Their tactics were aggressive, their strikes lethal. But what set them apart, what built that strange sense of trust, was that everything they did had discipline behind it, calculated, measured, efficient. In a war where chaos often reigned, the Australians didn't act on impulse. In Phuoc Tuy province, the Special Air Service, SAS patrols, moved like shadows. They didn't wear bright unit patches. They didn't carry loud radios or stomp through villages. They moved in 6-man teams, blending into the jungle, watching for hours before taking a single step. They spoke in whispers, used hand signals, and memorized terrain like it was scripture. And when they struck with precision. An NVA platoon leader, later captured, once explained it this way: "The Americans came like thunder, the South Vietnamese came like wind, but the Australians, they came like silence. And silence is the hardest to fight. That silence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Australians didn't boast. They didn't tape enemy bodies for propaganda or rush to claim body counts. Instead, they watched, waited, and acted when the odds were entirely in their favor. They called in artillery missions so accurate that some NVA survivors said it felt as if the earth had turned against them. Yet even then, the Australians didn't revel in destruction. They vanished again, ghosts in the trees. This discipline sent a message to the enemy: "We are not here to humiliate you. We are here to end you if you make us." That message, over time, created space for something unusual in war: predictability. In a fight for survival, predictability is a rare and powerful gift. The NVA didn't trust the Australians to be merciful. They trusted them to be consistent. In contrast, many VC and NVA troops viewed American and ARVN forces as unpredictable. The Americans could be overly aggressive, loud, and hasty, firing wildly in confusion, mistaking civilians for combatants, or reacting emotionally to ambushes. The ARVN, shaped by years of internal political strife and civil war trauma, had a reputation for personal vendettas, especially when handling prisoners. But with the Australians, the line between war and vengeance was clear. That clarity, more than anything else, influenced decisions in moments of crisis. When trapped, wounded, or cut off when surrender became the only chance to survive, NVA soldiers had to choose which enemy would see them as human once they dropped their weapons. And time and again, they chose the soldiers who never wasted a bullet, the ones who waited hours to fire a single shot, the ones who moved slowly, fought hard, and disappeared before the smoke cleared. They chose the soldiers who didn't ask to be trusted, but proved by their actions that they could be. By 1968, whispers about the Australians were spreading not only among the NVA, but even among Allied troops. In briefing tents, interpreter reports, and after-action interrogations, a quiet pattern emerged. Prisoners taken by Australian forces were more likely to cooperate, survive, and speak candidly. And it wasn't because they were treated kindly, it was because they were treated with dignity. There's a story that former SAS troopers still tell about a young Viet Cong fighter who was captured after a night patrol. He had been found in a spider hole, half-starved and shivering. The Australians pulled him out at gunpoint. He braced for kicks or fists, for the rage of men who had just lost friends in an ambush the day before. But none came. Instead, one SAS trooper offered him a canteen, another cut his bindings slightly to relieve pressure on his wrists, a third simply stood guard without a word. The prisoner was tied, yes. He was the enemy, yes. But he was no longer a threat, and once that line was crossed, the Australians never crossed it back. This wasn't a matter of policy, it was culture. It was the code of the soldier, deeply embedded in the Australian military tradition. From the jungles of Malaya to the islands of Borneo, Australian troops had learned to fight wars not just with bullets, but with principles. Their training emphasized control under pressure, professionalism even in the ugliest conditions, and that code didn't end when the shooting stopped. Australian troops understood the value of restraint, not out of pity, but out of purpose. Interrogators got better results when prisoners weren't terrified out of their minds. Locals were more likely to cooperate when they saw enemy wounded being treated rather than executed. And most of all, the men themselves could live with what they did. They didn't need to dehumanize the enemy to defeat them. One former platoon sergeant put it simply: "We were there to kill the threat, not humiliate the man." That approach didn't go unnoticed. NVA units that had once expected cruelty were thrown off when it didn't come. Captured soldiers often expressed confusion at their treatment, asking why they were given food, why no one screamed at them, why they were still alive. One NVA commander, later interrogated, admitted, "We told our men the Australians were devils. But devils do not give water to a wounded prisoner." It wasn't about mercy. The jungle didn't allow for mercy. It was about discipline, about drawing a line between battle and butchery and never crossing it. And in that discipline, in that strange moral clarity, the Australians won something more enduring than tactical victories. They won credibility, even in the eyes of those sent to kill them. In the chaos of guerrilla warfare, that credibility mattered. It became a quiet battlefield advantage. And when the time came when the enemy had to choose between surrendering to noise, vengeance, or control, they crawled toward control. They crawled toward the Australians. For all the stories told by former NVA and VC soldiers about surrendering to Australian troops, there's another side that's often overlooked: the perspective of the Australians themselves. Ask any veteran of the Royal Australian Regiment or the SAS who served in Vietnam, and you'll likely get the same answer when asked about enemy prisoners. We did what needed to be done. No more, no less. To many of them, there was no glory in taking prisoners, no satisfaction in humiliation. It wasn't weakness, it was professionalism. One former patrol commander recalled, "They were soldiers. We were soldiers. You beat the man when he's standing with a weapon. Once he drops it, you've beaten the man. There's no need to go further." That mindset didn't come from politics or doctrine. It came from culture, from training, from a uniquely Australian sense of honour that drew clear lines between combat and cruelty. Even when fighting an elusive, determined enemy, the Australians didn't see value in revenge. In fact, many of them actively rejected it. Australian units operated under the harshest conditions. Long-range patrols often lasted weeks with no resupply, no backup, and no guarantee of extraction. They relied on stealth, discipline, and mutual trust. That same discipline extended to how they handled those who surrendered. They were not naive. They knew the enemy could be ruthless. Many had lost friends to ambushes, booby traps, and sudden explosions, but they refused to let anger rule their actions. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about preserving the soul of the soldier, even in a war that often tried to strip it away. That's why they didn't abuse prisoners. That's why they didn't execute captives out of frustration. And that's why they earned something rare in counterinsurgency warfare: respect from their enemy. One Australian medic, interviewed decades later, recalled treating a young VC fighter who had been shot in the leg. The man barely spoke, but after receiving water and bandages, he simply nodded and said, "Come on, thank you." The medic didn't think much of it at the time, but years later, he realized how much it meant. In a war built on dehumanization, small moments of dignity became powerful acts. There were, of course, hard days. Days when patrols lost men to mines or snipers. Days when a captured VC would smile and say nothing, even as he watched the body of a fallen Australian being carried away. War didn't forgive easily. But still, the Australians held the line. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They didn't expect to be remembered for restraint, but their behaviour left a mark not just on the battlefield, but on the minds of those they fought. In the end, it wasn't medals or kill counts that defined their legacy. It was something quieter, something older, something harder to measure: honour in war. And the enemy noticed. The Vietnam War ended in chaos. Helicopters lifting off embassy rooftops. Flags changed. Governments fell. The North declared victory. The South dissolved. And all along the way, millions paid the price: soldiers, civilians, and generations yet unborn. But even as the war faded into memory, some lessons refused to be buried. Among them was the quiet legacy of how Australian troops conducted themselves, not just in how they fought, but in how they treated those they fought against. The NVA may have won the war, but the Australians won something deeper: the respect of their enemies. And that respect came not from propaganda or political campaigns, but from actions witnessed in the mud, blood, and jungle. It came from the way six-man patrols moved like shadows, struck like hammers, and vanished like smoke without ever losing their humanity. Years later, former North Vietnamese officers interviewed for post-war studies spoke openly about the Australians. One colonel admitted they were the most dangerous, but also the most predictable, and that made them less frightening. Another captured VC commander, who survived time as a prisoner under Australian guard, said, "They killed when necessary, but once the battle ended, they had rules. We never forgot that." These words weren't offered lightly. The North Vietnamese army was fiercely loyal, intensely disciplined, and taught to hate foreign invaders. But the Australians broke through that hatred not with kindness, but with consistency. They didn't need to win hearts and minds. They just needed to act with principle. And in the fog of guerrilla war, principle was rare enough to shine like fire. The impact was more than moral, it was tactical. Because of the Australians' reputation, NVA units often avoided areas where they believed SAS or RAR patrols were operating. They dispersed into smaller cells, travelled at night, and abandoned large concentrations of troops. This wasn't just fear, it was calculated avoidance. The Australians had reshaped the enemy's behaviour through silence, patience, and precision. And when prisoners were taken, cooperation came more easily. Interrogators found that captured fighters were less hostile, more open, and less fearful under Australian custody. The war was still brutal, but inside that brutality, a framework of trust had been built stone by stone, action by action. Today, the jungles of Phuoc Tui are quiet. Villages have returned. Farmlands grow where claymore mines once hid. Most of the soldiers are gone, either buried beneath the earth or grown old and forgotten. But in military training academies around the world, the Australian approach to jungle warfare lives on. Instructors teach cadets that stealth beats speed, that patience beats firepower, that seeing first is winning. But they also teach another, harder lesson. Respect is a weapon, and if even your enemy fears you but trusts you when they surrender, then you've done something no bomb ever could. The Australians didn't ask for that trust. They earned it. And that's why, even in the heart of war, the enemy chose to surrender to the shadow rather than run from the noise.